Jerry O'Reilly. I will be doing a very We have two wonderful moderators here. We have Peter Vermillier, a teacher and historian and writer and one of our favorite patrons. And we have Billy O'Reilly, who's one of Jerry's sons. And I just wanted to welcome everybody here today. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to have wine and cheese and snacks afterwards, so please go left out of the door when you exit, and we'll have everything all set up for you.
Very terrific.
Yes?
Thank you. Terrific. Thank you so much. We have a microphone here that we hope will pick up Jerry and Bill, and I'm the least important person to hear, so I'll try to project and stand if I need to. I'm going to read the text on the back of this postcard, which is about the forthcoming book, which, as you know, is Nuns, Nazis, and Notre Dame. And the subtitle is Stories of the Great Depression, World War II, and the Fighting Irish. So let me start with this. In Nuns, Nazis, and Notre Dame, author Tim Plekovich, am I saying that right?
You got it.
Examines the early life of Gerald A. O'Reilly. Jerry, the father of 6 and a longtime resident of Litchfield, was raised in Brooklyn, New York during the 1920s and 30s, when the Dodgers were king, stickball ruled the streets, and rumblings of another war in Europe shook the earth from across the Atlantic. His story takes us from the alleys of trolley car Brooklyn to the hallways of Notre Dame during legendary football coach Frank Leahy's national championship years, to the innermost thoughts of an elite 10th Mountain Division soldier thrust into the horror of battle in Italy's harsh Apennine Mountains. Jerry is the last surviving member of his company. I wonder if... Before we get to Jerry, I wonder if, Bill, if you would shed some light for us on how this project came about.
Yeah. First of all, when someone says my name is Bill O'Reilly, I say no relation. But at this point, I'm happy to say yes, there is a relation. I'm one of my father's 6 children that are here, and his 13 grandchildren that are here. Our generation was a little less prolific between the percals, as he would say, than the preceding generation. That's a Jerry O'Reillyism. This book happened in the most unusual way. And first of all, thank you to the library for being here, and Pete, for you to do the moderating, and for everyone to make the time on a Sunday to come. But the book came together in the most unlikely way, which I think is just kind of the way the mechanics of the universe work sometimes. I mean, Jerry O'Reilly has 6 children, 4 write for a living, and of course it's a teacher in Peoria, Illinois, that did the book. So, we're not very good children. But the author is a gentleman named Tim Plekovich, who I worked with in the 1980s in New York City. And he lived in Astoria for a while, and I knew him for a short time, and then he moved out to back to Peoria. He was originally a scout, a pitching scout for the Chicago Cubs, and then went into teaching. And one of his classes, middle school history class, was tracking World War II veterans whose fathers had been Civil War soldiers. And I guess they had remarried late in life. And it's obviously not a lot of people. And they started a correspondence with those veterans. And that turned into a book called Civil War Fathers. So suddenly Tim Plekovich became an author. And Facebook popped up on the planet. And he found me after 25 years. And we wrote back and forth. And he said, I'm thinking about doing another one on World War II veterans, and do you know anybody? Because that generation is passing so quickly. Do you know anybody? And I said, do I know anybody? I said, you should talk to my father. He's in the 10th Mountain Division. And Tim almost dropped the phone because the 10th Mountain was a pretty storied division during the war. Had one of the highest casualty rates in Europe. And so anyway, Tim was very interested. So we checked with my father and with Seton whether that would be okay. And long story short, about 1,000 phone calls, and 3 years later, the book is coming out.
4 years.
4 years. And no exaggeration, probably 1,000 plus. And Tim would call my father and ask a few questions and jot down some notes. They've never met. Tim was to be here today. The book, there was an illness in his family, so the book is delayed till October 9th. And so Tim was to be here today. They've never met. They've only spoken on the phone, and they are indeed fast friends. I will just take, before we begin, I want to just use one anecdote from history just to keep in mind throughout this. There was a lady with a capital L, kind of a royal lady in Europe, some centuries ago. And she was looking to marry, to meet the right man, and there were two gentlemen who were famed to be the most enchanting in Europe and to be the most eligible bachelors. And she went out with the first, and when she returned after the afternoon, she said to a friend, I need see no more. I have met the most charming man in all of Europe. But she had made the date for the next day with the other one, so she went through with it. And when she came back, she was glowing a little bit more, and she said, I have discovered today that I am the most charming woman in Europe. And if you could remember that, that's my father. My father refuses to speak about himself. And I was thinking, well, how are we going to get him to do it? I'm 54, I've never cracked him. So it may not happen today, but we're going to try. We may need some audience participation, some little jostling. But my father is constitutionally incapable, it's from manners. His manners do not allow him to talk about himself. He would rather kick this off by saying, and how about you? Where were you from? So with that in mind, I guess we can begin. Thank you. Thank you.
And just to give you a little sense of what we have planned and how we want this to run. We have questions, we'll have a back and forth, but we also have some excerpts from the book. And we want to make sure we share those. I got to read it. It's a treat. And I think you're in for a really great afternoon here. And Jerry, I wonder if we can start with you telling us a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Brooklyn in the 20s and 30s. I said earlier, if it was just to me, we'd talk for an hour about the Brooklyn Dodgers. I think we're not going to do that, but if you want to talk about growing up in Brooklyn with the Dodgers.
Back, he got it. There's not much to say. If you live through the Brooklyn Dodgers, you've seen it all. And I was delighted to be a part of that era.
Do you have a particularly favorite memory about the Dodgers?
I guess winning the World Series. You can't do much better than that.
And you...
Don't rush into this now.
We're going to be interviewing Pete in just a moment.
That's right. Would you tell us the story about being caught by the nuns at Ebbets Field?
Oh, it was a very beautiful day in Brooklyn. It's always beautiful there. And some bad guy, namely me, said, let's get out of here. Let's go out. The game is in progress. So we took off from school one by one, silently, and headed out to Ebbets Field, thinking no one missed us. But across the place came a word saying, well, the nuns are Class 3B, whatever it is, please return. Class is taking place, this is not a party. But it was something that we enjoyed and survived. And the nuns made us suffer terribly.
I wanted to ask about the punishment.
They made us eat with them at dinner. And they all had habits on. I've never eaten so quickly in my life. But we won.
And that's what mattered.
That's the game. Right. I guess the answer is yes.
And I think, in fact, like to talk about the Dodgers and what it meant. The book starts, and if anyone here from Brooklyn, I was born in '63, so the Dodgers had gone west already. But it was just cultural. I mean, it was just the Dodgers were everything. The opening line of the book, and I won't get this verbatim, was I was born on April 17, 1923, the day before Yankee Stadium opened, or the day Yankee Stadium opened, but it was too late. I was already a Dodger fan. That's the only and so it's really in the blood.
That's great.
I'm going to ask one more baseball question, then we'll move on to other things. But this is your baseball experience. Tell us a little bit about the game of stickball in Brooklyn.
We played every day, and the big fear was the cops. And the word used to be, Chickie, look out, here come the cops. And we'd run and hide until they left and out again. But the stickball was pretty special. You have to, we used to call it the Spalding. Not a Spalding, a Spalding.
And what was considered a pretty good shot?
The what?
What was considered a pretty good hit? You do it by the sewers, right?
Oh, that's right, yeah.
It was like a 3 sewer shot or 2 sewer
Two
shot?
and a half,
shots,
three
three-
sewer, that's right.
The book is Nuns, Nazis, and Notre Dame, and we have some pictures here of St. Saviour's School, and I wonder if...
First row, third from the...
You're right here. Am I right? Right here?
You got it.
Are there any, looking back on those days, any particular nuns that stick out in your memory?
Sister Blaze.
And why is that?
She was well named. You got in trouble with her, you didn't move on to the next grade. You were in big trouble. So I gave her a wide berth, as wide as I could.
Bill, I wonder if you would read the excerpt from the book about the trolley.
Oh, but the trolley, sure. I was gonna read about the day the nuns got you at the stadium.
Do we want to do that one?
Should I
Why don't we start with that one?
We'll start with that one. I'll
Start with
switch
that
over.
one,
Yeah,
please.
it's because Tex Rickard was a famous Brooklyn Dodgers announcer, and he was the one on the loudspeaker that said, "Well, the boys from St. Saviour's, please stay in your seats." They stopped the game,
You remember that.
and the nuns came and grabbed him by the ears out of the thing. So I'll go. I have fond memories of my childhood schooling at St. Saviour's in Brooklyn. It was right there in the neighborhood, and it had an excellent reputation, as it still does. It was the place to go. Sister Janella is one of the teachers who sticks out in my mind. She was a tough one. To use her words, she was a tartar. Boy, you better not mess around with her or you wouldn't have made it to the next grade. There are many stories I could share about the wonderful people of St. Saviour's, but one in particular is worth mentioning. I'd skipped school with some classmates to go to a game at Evansfield. There we were in the stands giggling at our escapade when we heard a startling announcement from Tex Rickards over the public address system. Will the boys from St. Saviour's report to the game to gate number 12 immediately? Sister Mary Joseph is coming to get you. The nuns had foiled our getaway. The nun, I really can't remember which one it was, met us at the designated gate and said, "That's it, you're done." And that was it. She marched us back to school. As punishment, as you mentioned before, for our high crime against humanity, our parents were called, and we had to eat dinner that night with the nuns in their convent. Believe me, I don't recall that my appetite was very good that night, nor do I remember my friends and I being engaged in any lively dinner chatter. We sat at one side of the table, and the nuns sat on the other in their habits, looking at us. It was the longest meal of my life, and I never skipped school again.
That's great.
What do we? Let's segue from that because the Brooklyn Dodgers, it's short for the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers.
Right.
And you have a particularly striking story about a different way of dodging a trolley, like not actually getting out of the way of it,
Yeah.
and of laying down in the bed.
In the bed, under the...
And I wonder if you would tell that story. I know Bill has the excerpt as well, if he wanted to
Go
fill
ahead,
that
you
in.
take it.
Let me,
Take it.
why don't you go ahead while I look for the excerpt? Clang with the trolley. So by the way, the Brooklyn Dodgers, there was also an NFL team called the Brooklyn Dodgers, and but the Dodgers were obviously
Like on
the
Friday
baseball
nights.
team. Friday nights, right? Exactly. And so the Dodgers were everything, and they were of course named after the trolleys, as Pete mentioned. And so my father and his friends of multi-nationalities, was kind of the Irish, the Italians, the Syrians, a few others were in there in the neighborhood. They would often roller skate and then catch onto the back of the trolley as they went, or just do a hop onto it. And so my father, who was always looking to get to a Mickey Rooney movie and put a few nickels together, went around the neighborhood and said, because the subway system ran as well, and they said, how much if I lie under the subway car? And so they put together nickels. I think it was a whole $1 that you got. And so the subway came by, whatever the IRT, whatever the train was, and my father underneath, and there was just enough space, and it passed over his head, and he said when he looked up, he saw a look of disappointment on his friend's eyes. They actually had to give him the dough. So, Do you want to go ahead and read it? Yeah. Yeah, so because streetcars were so ubiquitous when I was growing up in Brooklyn, the subway system wasn't nearly as expansive as it is today. The trolley cars were seemingly everywhere. Every workday they'd be packed with commuters early in the morning and again late in the afternoon. They'd also be pretty full during the middle of the day. We children would use the trolley cars a lot, although we took a much less conventional approach. For one thing, we'd always get in the last car, after it was already in motion. Our attempted leaps onto the trolley weren't always successful, but the chance to avoid paying the nickel fare made them worth the effort. Learning to jump on the back of a moving trolley was actually quite an art. After a while, you'd start to get a feel for whether you'd be able to pull yourself up or end up falling smack down on the hard pavement. And so a lot of times, we'd end up jumping off to avoid the fall. After all, probably wasn't such a good idea to risk life and limb over a nickel. One day I graduated from trolley car leaps to an even more harrowing stunt, lying in the subway tracks and allowing a train to pass over me. It was a stupid thing to do, but for several of my friends had dared me to do it, so I did. Well, you know what? It worked. There was just enough room for both the train and me, although I think that kind of surprised a few of my friends who were watching. Some actually looked shocked that I'd made it. Some, I might add, even seemed a little annoyed. I think maybe a few of them had made bets with one another to see if I'd make it. Needless to say, it was a stunt I only tried once. The 6 children, thank you.
We do have some younger people in the audience who we should tell, don't try that. Jerry, looking back on your younger years growing up in Brooklyn, what would you say were the big influences on your life? Or who's the biggest influence on your life?
My mother.
And why is that?
She was everywhere, knew everything. She was the perfect person. Simple as that. She was always there when you needed her.
And she...
I was going to say, can you tell us a little bit about your mother's background?
That's
where she came from.
Go, yeah. She had an influence on...
And lived around the world and just...
She was sort of an international gal. She was married in Copenhagen, and a country or town to which I've never been, but was always there, just a very special person. It was always, mother can do it, and she did it, whatever the challenge was.
And she grew up, part of her childhood was on the campus of Notre Dame, where her father was the head of the English department, and he ended up being, in the Foreign Service, he was an ambassador to Denmark under a number of presidents. And so
Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson.
Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, a very good friendship with Teddy Roosevelt, and also lived in the Philippines. In fact, when they lived just outside of Manila at one point, they had their all their kind of treasured items sink in the Manila Bay. There was a ship. I don't think it was worth that much, but it was it meant things to them. But she did move around a lot and was ended up and married in Copenhagen. There may be a photo here.
And am I remembering correctly that your parents were introduced to each other by Teddy Roosevelt?
Yes, yeah.
And how about your brother Mo? He was a special influence on
He
you.
became the father, because I guess I was 13, I think, when my father died. And Mo was always the man. Got a problem? Check with Mo. But he was a very special guy in my life.
That was the other option, was that when they went off to war, our Uncle Mobo and my father's brother said, don't skyline yourself. And I was going to use that as the anecdote for my father not talking about himself. Don't skyline, don't stand up in combat and skyline yourself. But it's, yeah, but go ahead, Peter.
No, that's fine. So I wanted to transition that then to the war. And so were you out of high school? Were you at Notre Dame when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
Yeah, it was just getting underway in 1941.
And what was the reaction at Notre Dame?
We got to do it, and we will. It was very simple, just had to win.
And I think you had it in your blood. I mean, my father's father was actually, to get an idea of how long or short history can go. My father's father was in the Spanish-American War, and he fought with Arthur MacArthur, who was Douglas MacArthur's father, in the Philippines, and I think that's where he got to know President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, then an officer, and so I think there was a little bit of that where if something happened, you were going to jump in there and do it. Yeah. So anyway, back to Pearl Harbor. Do you remember where you were that day or what was going on campus?
I was a freshman at Notre Dame, on a Sunday afternoon watching a movie. And the word got around, and we all, phew, the movie's over, get out of here and start praying.
Right.
Which we did.
What on earth made you join a ski patrol?
Yeah, I wanted to.
Did you ever ski before the war?
Only in my mind.
So this is the 10th Mountain Division, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the training and what went into it. But these are soldiers who, in many cases, are taught to fight on skis, right? To transport themselves on skis. And I think, I mean, that's one thing that really jumped out at me, is that you were a kid who grew up in Brooklyn, and not as a skier, but sledding in Prospect Park. And what on earth made you join a detachment of troops on skis?
Just seemed like another challenge. Despite me, we won.
And I think for context, the 10th Mountain Division was put together because there were no mountain soldiers in America. And they existed in Europe. The Finns had very good mountain soldiers, the Russians had good mountain soldiers, and the Germans had very good mountain soldiers. And the Germans had, of course, were in Italy, and they dug into the mountains, and in the Apennine Mountains, and they were blocking the Po Valley, which was the run that the Americans and Allies had to go up. There was a mountain there called Mount Belvedere that was considered insurmountable, and the British tried going up there a few times, kind of ropes and guns kind of stuff.
Try me.
That didn't work out. The Brazilians tried it. That didn't work out. So the 10th Mountain Division was put together, and it was. And Pete will talk, and my father will talk about some of the training that they did, but they were specifically put together to take that mountain and to break that valley and then to go up. Just in case I forget to mention it, I read the biography a couple of years ago of the German general who led the troops. He was a well-known German general who led the troops against the 10th Mountain Division. He had fought in Russia, in Poland, in France, and he said that the 10th Mountain Division soldiers were the finest troops he'd ever been against. And it was pretty amazing.
He said they fight as if in jest.
Those crazy college boys, they fight as though in jest.
Yeah, well, tell us what he meant by that. What does he mean that they fight in jest?
Well, we knew we were going to win. So it's just a question of how we would do it.
The training that the 10th Mountain Division underwent was really some of the most difficult, some of the most strenuous training that any soldiers in history have gone through. I wonder, I know we have an excerpt we can get to on that, but or Jerry, would you tell us, what are your memories of that training?
Cold.
This was in Colorado, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or this part of it was in the mountains of Colorado.
In the evening after chow, as they call it.
We have pictures.
Nice fish. And one behind also.
Try.
So it was in Colorado. It was cold.
Yeah.
How did they train you for this what type of exercises? What kind of activities?
You're on your own. At nighttime, you just dig into the ground, get in the ground, and hope the day would start sooner than later.
And well, you were sent into the woods without food every night, right? You had to find your own food.
That's right. Yeah.
I read a book about the 10th Mountain a couple of years ago that my brother Jerry sent, or Peter sent, and they said that the D series training was the most severe the Army ever did. They don't, more than Navy SEALs, more than Rangers, more than anything. But they wouldn't do it today. It was illegal. And you've said that the D series was worse than the combat.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Phil, do you want to read the excerpt on,
Sure,
on D-Series training?
Yeah, toward the end of March '44, we began our infamous D-Series program at Camp Hale. Camp Hale is in Colorado, outside of Colorado Springs. This program is considered by most historians to have been the most brutal succession of training exercises ever completed by any U.S. military force. The training lasted 4 weeks and the weather was unbelievably bad. The first day out, the temperature dropped to 30 below zero. Remember, we were climbing at altitudes of more than 13,000 feet, so the air was dangerously thin. Imagine trying to make that kind of climb under constant blizzard conditions in sub-zero weather while carrying a 90-pound pack. At 140 pounds, I began to feel that it was soon going to be my turn to say, "Take me out, coach."
I was 138.
You're 138? Always the svelte. Not surprisingly, there were guys who did take themselves out by intentionally wounding themselves. One sure method of inflicting harm on oneself was achieved by removing a boot and smashing into one's foot with the butt end of a rifle. Then there were those guys who would intentionally stand around in the cold and do nothing until they developed frostbite. Fortunately, reports of such incidents remain low, although I did witness men who resorted to these types of tactics. During our D-series training, there were nearly 1,400 cases of reported sickness. Most of these cases were probably the result of troops having to perform their exercises in such high altitudes. I can remember guys who specifically became ill for this reason. Something that has remained as clear in my mind today as it was more than 70 years ago was the way in which our officers would scream out their orders to us under these brutal conditions. It seems they were constantly yelling, "Pick up the pace!" They, of course, wouldn't make the climb wearing 90-pound packs in the sinking snow. They weren't negotiating the horrible elements and difficult terrain wearing snowshoes or skis. They were riding alongside or past us in their made-for-the-mountain-type vehicles known as weasels. Also, I think if we don't mention it later, there were, during the war, when my father was wounded, he was wounded twice in Italy, and he entered the hospital, there were troops that were wounded, and it would say SIW at the bottom of the cot, and it was self-inflicted wound. It was troops, these weren't 10th Mountain, but they would shoot their feet to take themselves out of the war. So.
Thank you, Bill. Take it, Jay Abbott.
Doc.
You traveled on a steamship to Europe, am I remember correctly?
Yes.
Yes. And went directly to Italy?
Yes, to Naples. See Naples and die.
And then the 10th Mountain Division was sent into this battle that Bill spoke of at Mount Belvedere.
Right.
Um,
The general said, we were going to take Belvedere, he said, we're going to take it by daylight at all costs.
at all costs.
You're talking to me?
And then, right. And just thinking back on history, you know, that's not, you hear generals talk this way, but I think when you have here one of the men to whom this was said, it takes on a more immediate purpose to us.
Yeah.
At all costs, we can understand what that means. I'm sorry, Bill, you were going to say.
No, I was just going to say, I guess General Hayes made that pronouncement. I was going to ask, I remember you telling your children when we were younger that, you know, your instinct is to cut and run, but the guy next to you isn't going to run, so you don't, and he's thinking the same thing. Is that?
That's the only reason you do it.
Yeah. Well, can you describe what Belvedere looked like from the ground the night before when they said take it at all costs?
It looked like a mountain. And we did.
And the Germans, of course, were dug in on the top. I mean, they had, you know, bunkers and machine guns. I mean,
The
everything.
ultimate
They've
king
been
of
there
the
for
hill.
years.
You have the Germans on top of the mountain, you're at the bottom of the mountain. Your general has said you are to take this at all costs. What goes through your mind? How do you get yourself through that situation day after
I
day?
just hope they stop singing Lily Marlene.
Tell us about that. The Germans are singing.
All night they go, oh, do you know the song?
A little bit.
I won't bore you.
Okay.
But it was, you know, we won despite it all.
I read in the book it talks about them singing Lily Marlene.
Yeah.
And I won't use the language that came back from the Americans. Some of it was in Italian.
How's your spell?
And some of it was Brooklynese. You know, not from you.
I don't know the name guy.
What was it like? Like you're there at night, you're in the cold, you're lying in a foxhole, and you're hearing other people sing Lily Marlene. Is there any sympathy for them, or are they, like, or is it just kill or be killed? Is it?
Kill or be killed.
Yeah,
Simple as that.
that's right. They're gonna come get you if you don't get them.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we won despite me.
Yeah. So how did Belvedere go?
We took it.
It was a good ending. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to tell us, there's a saying or a prayer that you had told yourself over and over about a silver horn.
Oh.
Am I remembering this correctly?
On the day Christ was born.
On the day Christ was born, did he get a silver cup? Did he get a horn? Did the people like him? Was the morning bright?
And this was something that you had told yourself there in combat as you're facing this dire situation.
Right, exactly right.
Can you talk a little bit, Daddy, about the German tactics, what they would do? Like, for example, you would talk about how they would...
Booby traps and stuff?
Yeah, this is
they'd
really...
they'd strafe the road in the booby traps, that type of thing.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you said it all.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you can say it better, because you were there. I guess the Germans were, and they were cute. I mean, I guess it happens in any war, but they would fly, Messerschmitts over the roads as they saw the troops come by, and they would have been there the morning before, putting mines along the side of the road. And so, of course, as the planes came down to strafe, the soldiers would jump into the sides and go up with the mines. The Germans would also they booby trap their own wounded soldiers, knowing that the Americans would treat them. They would go to treat them, and when they went to help them medically, they would go up. Booby trap Americans that had been killed. I mean, they were.
This isn't really, in some ways, war at its most brutal. You have, human bodies being used as weapons. The tactics that you're talking about, the high altitudes, the frigid temperatures. It's extremely brutal stuff.
Right, and
going on.
the Germans did execute a lot of prisoners. It happened a little bit on both sides. It was mostly, I think, reserved to SS that were. But there were difficult times. I remember as a little boy, you telling us in New York about that your company had captured a lot of German troops, but they were in the middle of a firefight and they couldn't get them back. So there's no choice but to march them through a minefield. It was just go, but there's no choice. You can't. You let them go, they're going to kill you. And so it's reality. It's war. And it's that's
Billy?
yes.
We have the Purple Heart and Bronze Star here.
Oh, do you want?
We do.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Bill, if you want to
Read this. Sure.
read the citation.
Yeah.
Like,
You have it right here.
No, it's, oh.
Yes, here it is. Yes.
So we have the. Oh, that's going to fall off. We have the Purple Heart. I don't want to hold it up too high and fall. And the Bronze Star, I'm not going to hold it at all up. It's here. It looks like if I hold it up, it's going to fall right out.
Yeah.
I thought I pinned it.
And my father served a lot of functions. He was in the 85th Mortar Company, and but also and was a staff sergeant when the Bronze Stars was assigned. But he would also sometimes the Germans, again being cute, would pick off the medics. They'd say, and they would have the red crosses on the helmets, and that would be a target for the Germans. And they would take out the medics, and so sometimes my father would serve as a medic. I don't think you would like blood if you were like your sons, but he would go around and stick the morphine in the legs was the best you could do at some point. All very quick stuff. But this is the commendation from the day that my father won the Bronze Star. Bronze Star Citation Headquarters, 10th Mountain Division, APO 345, U.S. Army, 4th of May, 1945. Gerald A. O'Reilly, Staff Sergeant Infantry, New York, United States Army, for heroic achievement in action on February 21, 1945. Near Mount Belvedere, Italy, when enemy machine gun fire pinned down an attacking platoon on the forward slope of a mountain and intense mortar and artillery barrages pounded the group's position. Staff Sergeant O'Reilly, Mortar Section Sergeant, left his covered emplacement to crawl down to the men under hostile observation, stringing telephone wire behind him. When he reached the most forward element of the assault platoon, he directed the fire of his mortar section in reducing the troublesome machine gun emplacement, and so accurate was his sensing, in spite of the terrific shelling, that the second round landed squarely on the enemy emplacement, killing 5 hostile soldiers. Thus relieved from their precarious position, the assaulting rifleman went on to capture all objectives. By his heroic and aggressive action at a critical time and his coolness under fire, coolness from Maine, as you can see, Staff Sergeant O'Reilly has proven himself worthy of the finest tradition of the United States Army and earned the commendation and praise of all. Entered the military service from Brooklyn, New York by Commander of Major General Hayes. His 5th Army.
I got a quick question. I read that the attack on Mount Belvedere was in 1945, in February. Okay, so what date did you join the Army? You left the period of time from 41 at the attack of Pearl Harbor, and here it is, 44, he had to go into service, probably, and went to Colorado, then got stationed, activated out of Fort Drum, and they went, because my father-in-law was in the 10th division with
was
you. Yes, he was.
Is he still with us?
No, he's not. No.
I would have liked him.
Oh, yeah, you would have loved him.
You would have been attracted by his curly red hair representing the
Oh.
Irish.
Anybody that has hair distracts me.
What are you talking about?
Side pocket.
But I think,
I'm pure Italian, too.
I see.
I think you went in 43, is that right? I think so. There was the training was very long in Colorado, and then they were sent to Texas actually for a short time. So you had mountain troops in flat Texas, and they were not happy about it. They were anxious to go. But the 10th Mountain. I mean, there's a story. There are movies made and books written about the Bob Dole, which my father always says a replacement. You always say replacement. Bob Dole was there. I just went to one off story about the 10th Mountain. My mother-in-law, Louisa Beveridge, is here. She knew a gentleman from Italy, and she knew a gentleman from New Rochelle, New York, just a neighbor, who died a few years ago. And he wasn't a well-known guy, a regular neighborhood guy. And she went to the wake, and in walked Senator Bob Dole. The funeral was for the man who was a 10th Mountain Division soldier that pulled him from the field when he was wounded. And Bob Dole never forgot it. And 70 years later, or 68 years later, traveled there to be at his wake. And Bob Dole was not in good shape at the time. Tells you about these guys and how close-knit they were.
One thing, and you bring this point up, and I think it's, to me, a really interesting idea, is that this is very, very late in the war. There's the battle here at Mount Belvedere. And then, so sort of to transition, you come out of these horrors that we've described, and then you go back, Jerry, to Notre Dame.
Right.
And you left as 20-year-old kids,
Yeah.
and you go through this experience in the war, and then you go back to college. And was the atmosphere, was the environment at Notre Dame changed?
No, it was just great. We won.
And so did the Irish.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
You brought a Beretta back from, I understand you picked an Italian Beretta, a handgun, from off a German officer. What happened to that Beretta?
I traded it for a coat, for some of Lamb's World coat.
At Notre Dame, right?
At Notre Dame, right.
Pretty good trade.
I couldn't do much with a Beretta, but I could use a coat.
And that was maybe the last gun you ever touched, is that right?
The last one?
The last gun you ever touched?
I thought you said talked about Seton.
You really threw yourself into life at Notre Dame. You were a tennis player,
Right.
and active in the Glee Club. And I wonder if you have a particular memory about a solo performance with the Glee Club.
For some reason, the director decided that they were going to have a particular soloist, but wouldn't announce it beforehand. And I remember standing there, you say, we were in Erie, Pennsylvania, a local high school, and for our musical pleasure, the singing voice from Brooklyn, New York, Gerald O'Reilly. And I got through it.
Which is a great segue to another story.
Which I hope that we could read the excerpt from about
Exactly.
Sonny Egan.
I'll mention two other things quickly, just because they're bits in the book that you may be interested in. One was that my father was one of the soldiers that took Mussolini's house in Bari, and they drank his wine. They raided the cell and drank his wine outside of it. The second thing is my father was in Rome. Was one of the few soldiers that was given an audience with the Pope. It was Pius XII, and my father lied to him. He said Pius XII spoke at Notre Dame in 1936. And my father, always, the genial person trying to form a bond, said, "Oh, Your Eminence," or what you call Pope, "Your Eminence, I saw you speak at Notre Dame in 1936. My father's a 13-year-old kid in Brooklyn." But it's venial. It's no trouble.
I went to confession.
So my father's brother, Jack O'Reilly, was quite a character, and And he was a radio host for many, many years in New York and then in Philadelphia and later in Arizona. Used to do a show with Guy Lombardo at the Roosevelt Hotel every Sunday. And he was the first New York Knicks television broadcaster, but quite a character. He passed a few years ago. But he had this tendency, that, like some of my father's children, to exaggerate just wildly. And so while my father was in the war, and he was talking about this marvelous singer that was coming out of nowhere, and he was going to be, I guess it was after the war, because it was maybe in the 50s. Because he said, this is the next Frank Sinatra. You're going to forget about old Blue Eyes. This is the guy. His name is Sonny Egan. And Sonny Egan was a nickname for my father. And so he said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get him in town. He's going to sing. He's going to do that. I'll read you the excerpts about Sonny Egan's abbreviated career. My brother Jack was a well-known radio personality in New York and later in Philadelphia. After I graduated from Notre Dame, Jack became convinced I could be marketed as America's next great singing talent. He would, he said, be more than willing to give me my first big break. I imagine he also had designs on being my publicist, booking agent, contract negotiator, and financial consultant once I hit big. The first step, though, was to market me over the airwaves of the radio station where he worked. This guy's going to be bigger than Frank Sinatra, Jack proclaimed for weeks on his WHOM listening audience. He was also OR. The voice of Sonny Egan, the voice of Sonny Egan, the maternally rooted stage name he'd been given, will soon be heard right here, exclusive on WHOM. So keep it tuned to 1450 on your dial. The WHOM studios were located in Midtown Manhattan on West 52nd Street. Arrangements had been made for me to arrive at the station a little before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I was under the impression we were going to tape my song. But that wasn't how it worked out. I ended up going on, in quotes, live. I spent the better part of the day walking all over Manhattan, rehearsing my song, It Might As Well Be Spring, which you may remember as the Rodgers and Hammerstein number sung by Gene Crane in the movie State Fair. Dick Himes and Frank Sinatra sang great renditions of that tune. I sure didn't. At least not over the radio. By the time I met Jack at the studio, my voice was so hoarse I could barely speak, let alone sing, and I had a terrible case of the jitters going. My hands were trembling and my knees were knocking together. I'd have rather been back in Italy, to tell you the truth. Nothing against Italy. All at once, the station engineer stuck a microphone in my face and turned on a switch. Jack's voice came loudly over the intercom, lacking none of its characteristic hyperbole. And now, coming to you this afternoon, directly from our studios in Midtown Manhattan. He was Ted Baxter before Ted Baxter. Yeah. In Midtown Manhattan is the next great voice to grace the airwaves over our metropolis. You've heard me say it many times. Ladies and gentlemen, mark my words. The young man you are about to hear is going to be the next great singing sensation. He's the voice of the future here today, exclusively on WHOM. So remember where you heard him first. Here he is, the one, the only, the incomparable Sonny Egan. Silence ensued. The dead air probably only lasted a second or two, but it felt like eternity. It felt as if everyone in New York, all 8 million of them, had turned in to listen to me choke. Do I really have to do this, I thought to myself. Eventually the words came out, but I was awful, despite Jack's high-pitched assurances later that night. If I remember correctly, I tossed my cookies to the WHOM's men's room on the way out. Gerald O'Reilly may have survived the war, but Sonny Egan didn't stand a chance. It was a TKO in the first for Egan behind the mic.
Jerry,
So,
we're getting close here.
What was New York like? Like you were there in the days where 53rd Street, all the jazz clubs.
We have the pictures here.
Special time, Historic Club,
and you talk about Toots Shore in the book. And
what were those days like? I mean, yeah, you came back from the war like I guess everyone, there were jobs around, so you had a few bucks in your pocket, and everybody probably felt pretty optimistic, right, in those days?
oh sure, yeah.
What was New York like?
Swing it.
Can you tell us stories?
Not with her here.
I'll just read one thing. I first noticed Seton on Fifth Avenue. This is all I'll say about you, Seton, because it was even more reserved than my father. I first met Seton on the Fifth Avenue bus early one morning. It was the bus I took to and from Chanel. I worked at Chanel, the French perfume company where I was then working. She was absolutely gorgeous, with exquisite posture, beautiful olive skin, and great legs.
Jerry, we want to hear about the Stork Club. What else can you tell us about the Stork Club?
I lived there. I spent a lot of time there, just solo in the early evening. But it usually worked out okay.
That was the place where everybody knew your name.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. You had to be the guy at the door. So I looked you over, and if he didn't know you, he'd say, "Out of here."
But they knew you.
They knew.
Sports has been a really important part of your life.
Back, he caught it.
That's right. And tell us about, I have a particular favorite from the book, and I don't know, that's for Yankee fans, is your encounter with George Steinbrenner. But tell us about some of the other people, your encounters with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Frank Gifford. In what context did you meet them? How did you come to meet so many of these athletes?
Lived at the same apartment building where I lived, so I'd see him a lot.
Okay.
You know, hi, Mr. Gifford. I wasn't being cozy with him, but nothing special. Just
This was part of living in New York in that era.
Yeah, I knew where to go at the end of the night.
Okay.
And I always
I
loved the
didn't
story.
say day, I said night.
Right.
I always love the story you tell about Frank Gifford. When our sister Priscilla was born, she was born on the bathroom floor on 53rd Street. And she came from, and her nickname was Speedy for some time. And so her umbilical cord was tied with Saks Fifth Avenue ribbon, Christmas ribbon. And so as the police officer, and Pitts showed up, and police officers came, and my father was trying to give them drinks, and they were like, "No, we can't." He's like, "Ah, I have one." And so they shut off to the hospital, and my father ran out to get a cab, and the person who was reaching the door for the door at the same time was Frank Gifford. But he gave you the cab, didn't he?
Yes.
Okay, good, okay. He's not all bad.
I'll give the teaser on the George Steinbrenner story, which was the airport was being closed for a blizzard, and George Steinbrenner, they were in Chicago.
This is my assistant.
Right.
Do
Do you want to tell the story?
That's about it.
Okay, so
You go ahead.
there's a blizzard in Chicago. The airport is shutting down. Everybody needs to find a hotel. There's not going to be enough hotel rooms. They call Steinbrenner, the owner of the Yankees, up to the desk. They give him a phone. He's talking to the hotel saying, "I need that suite that I had last night. I'll take it at any price." And while he's on the phone, Jerry hands him a note saying, "I also need a room for my assistant, Jerry O'Reilly." The Yankee fan liked that one.
And a thank you note went out. It did.
I wonder in our last few minutes here, and I don't know if we have any audience questions, but, and I'd like to call maybe on the O'Reilly children to help with this one, because I've heard a lot of this, that over the years there's been a lot of sayings that, Jerry, you've shared with your children, and I wonder what maybe some of the children
Before
remember.
Trish
Those.
sings, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think the one that some of us are paralyzed by is if you're not early, you're late. That's my favorite.
Organization is happiness.
My age, right?
Peter?
There's so many of them. Mainly it's just you forget that he doesn't speak the normal language that the rest of us do. And so you'd have friends come over and he'd say, "Hey, he took the Toledos out." Meaning what do you do? When are you getting together with Jolt and Joe?
Right.
Meaning, of course, when do you graduate?
No. Actually, yeah, exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
It's actually, I think it's when you get married. No, it's when you graduate, right? Because Joe did marry Jolt, exactly.
Yeah.
The movie The Graduate. Right.
The song that was in The Graduate. It made perfect sense to him after a while. Then we had to explain stuff. And nobody had a name. It was all, "How's Stretch? What's Slats doing?" You know?
Jerry.
Yeah, any
any sport in the Swarm has kind of been the North Star of my life. So that is,
He now works for the NFL, so there you go.
Gerald, what are the 10 words?
Was it what?
The 10 two-letter words that you...
If it is to be, it is up to me.
Keepers.
Very simple.
Now, what were some of the best sports moments? What are some of the great games that you've seen over the years? And you've seen a few. Great sports games that you've been to, or track, or...
I think Johnny Vandermeer's second no-hitter.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there. I was there for both of them.
Understand. People can talk all they want about what's the baseball record that's never going to be broken. Oh, Joe DiMaggio hitting streak, or Cal Ripken's consecutive game streak. The baseball record that's never going to be broken is Johnny Vandermeer throwing 2 consecutive no-hitters. Think about it. You've got to throw 3 to break the record. And Jerry was there to see both of them.
Also, if you end up getting the book, my father was given an autographed baseball from Babe Ruth in I guess, 32 or 33. He was in Brooklyn for an event, and so what did they do? They went into Prospect Park and played baseball with it.
Oh, yeah, we lost. I said, don't worry, I'll be right back. I've got a ball at home. We're signed by Babe Ruth. Lost about an inning and a half. Oh. Could have made a bundle.
Absolutely.
Joe, what's that worth now? $400,000?
A lot. We don't need to say more than a lot.
Go in the library.
How about the audience?
I spent a lot of time riding up and down the road with Jerry to Pinewoods, and he goes to play. We used to play tennis a lot together. In later years, he stopped, but and on the way up to Pinewoods, our conversation would be such. He said, "No, that's the past subjunctive. You got to put." He's always correcting my grammar. The other day, I had a chance to observe him with a professional who was doing a short interview with him, John Torziello, and John talked to him, and Jerry giving them quips just like he did with you, and said, "Well, don't hurry along here." He insulted John, just a very cute little thing. And John said, "Hey, you want me to talk nice about you, don't you?" And he said, "That would be nicely."
By the way, I should add that my father played on the Notre Dame tennis team. He was in the doubles team. And wouldn't you know it, the year 1945, when he was in the war, they won the national championship.
Well, I was going to ask if you still have your fabulous plaid Christmas pants, which is the first time I ever met you. You showed up at the door and Pellman opened it, and a big in your hand is great red plaid Christmas pants that probably still fit you. But I really wanted to ask you if you kept in touch with your friends after the war, all the people you became so close to.
Two guys, Bill Keel, Bob Van Ray. It doesn't mean anything to anybody except to me, but they were very close friends. They remain so.
They might be in this picture from your bachelor party.
Yeah. First row, third from the right.
This is you? Yes. Wow. And this is your brother Mo?
Brother Mo.
Yeah.
Paul Ward, Jack O'Connell, Sonny Egan. Good bunch of guys. Good drinkers.
Daddy, I was always so moved. You told the story of an army after the war when some of your buddies came to dinner, and there was that one of the soldiers, one of your friends, that lost his arm.
Oh.
Can you tell that story? Because I just says a lot about who Normie was too.
Oh, well, it was a guy, Dick Chambers, who had even lost part of his hand, was having dinner with us, and Normie was sitting at the head of the table, tears just coming down her cheeks. And she would say, "I love you, dear, and I'll cut it for you, dear," very solicitous, but they were good guys. Not too many of them do I keep in touch with. Not too many of them are still around.
Can you tell us how they lost you for many years? And found you?
How'd that work out?
Well, when you got out of the 10th Mountain Division, you were, I think it's interesting, they were coming back by ship from Italy. Victory in Europe had taken place, but in the victory in the Japan.
Headed to Japan. You were headed to
Was
Japan.
still going on. And so you were coming home, your Tenth Mountain, those of you who were left, were coming home into New York Harbor, and then they were supposed to go by train across country and be shipped out to whatever. As you came into by the Statue of Liberty, you got the word that there was, victory and the war was over in Japan. And so, you just, you wanted to get home to Brooklyn. And you never really, obviously signed this, we have the discharge paper, so we know it's legal. But but you didn't immediately go back. You just wanted to go to school.
Right.
And that was it. And so he wasn't in the roster of the 10th Mountain Division. They couldn't find him, so finally, only about 15 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, they started looking. They called the other Bill O'Reilly in New York to see if he was related. Finally, someone thought, we'll check Notre Dame. They might have alumni listing. And so I remember standing in our library here in Litchfield, got this phone call saying, where was you? We thought you were dead.
There was Charlie Bellavia.
Charlie Bellavia, your staff sergeant. What did you call him?
Three guys, two other guys and I were inseparable. And he used to say, you three freaking mistakes. Three mistakes.
Yeah. But, so we then did get back to reunions, wonderful reunions at Vail, at where else? A couple of different places we went to, Sun Valley, and interesting. There was such a range of people in the 10th Mountain, from these incredibly elite skiers. Jerry, I think it's interesting what a lot of the skiers did after the war. What did they start in this country?
They started ski headquarters, companies.
Yeah, but they really started the only ski resort at that point was Sun Valley,
Right.
and probably every other ski place in the east and west was started by 10th Mountain.
Right.
To go to Killington or Snow, any of those are from 10th Mountain.
And there's a 10th Mountain Division.
All I can say is
museum in Canada.
track.
So we had some fun at the reunions. They were interesting. Lots of hairy stories.
I got a question. He's the only survivor of the 10th Mountain Division in Connecticut or the United States?
His company, the motor company.
Mortar company.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I don't know what my father-in-law was in, but the stories he's telling, I'm recollecting some of the stories because he told me before he passed away, and how they were taking out the machine gun nests.
Right.
Now, I don't know if he was in the mortar company or not. I got to look into that.
And he also told a story about Mussolini, about walking through that section of Italy and drinking wine, and all the people kind of hid in their houses, and they weren't, when he went into the bar, they were just going to give him some cheap kind of cheese, and then they said who they were, and the bartender got out the best cheese and the best sausage and everything, and he had a good time because he was very thin and undernourished.
I have to add one Italy story where we just have a couple of minutes, is that my mother-in-law is here, Louisa Beveridge, who grew up in More, Italy, which is about an hour south of Naples in the mountains, and I got to visit it for the first time this month. And just a beautiful small town of about 500. And when she was little, she remembered the Germans held her town, and my mother-in-law's father ended up being killed by the Germans in a camp, which was sad. He was in the Italian army, and then when they switched. But she remembers the Germans, and they would hide their food, what little rations they had in your home, Nanny. I mean, do you want to stand up and just give a wave? Yeah. And so they would come and take everything that they had. And when the American troops came, they would throw candy to the children, and she never forgot it. And she knew that different color uniform, go for the ones in the green. The Americans once took Nanny down for like a mile down to where they were bivouacked, and your mother, I guess, went crazy. Who took it? The soldiers took it, and you came back with an armful of candy. But my father recalls going through Italy, through Italy around Naples, throwing candy to the children. So I always like to conflate the two stories and say my father gave my mother-in-law candy, and I'm sticking. And Uncle Jack allows me to do it.
Is there anybody else, a last question, a last thought?
I have one question. Jerry, what was the dinner the nuns served that night?
The dinner. When you got caught at the baseball game by the nuns, what did they serve you to eat?
Shad Row.
I think we're out of time.
I thought they might be ballpark friends.
Ballpark.
Nathan's.
I think we're out of time, but not out of stories, which is why you need to get yourself a copy of the book when it comes out in a few weeks, right? October. And the library will have copies. And I'll end with two last thoughts. One, our local historical societies really need the kind of history that Jerry's talking about here today. Second half of the 20th century, the 20th century history, we have lots of holdings from 1700 and 1800, but not 1940. And we have lots of memories in this room and lots of collections that we can put together from this room. So keep those historical societies in mind with that history. And the second thing is, a number of years ago, Tom Brokaw proclaimed the World War II generation as the greatest generation. And I think when we listen to Jerry, we really understand why. So Jerry, thank you so much.
Hope he's a Yankee fan now.